Patrik Paulov, you are a freelance writer and author based in Gothenburg, Sweden, and you're the author of Syria's Silenced Voices, 10 Years of War and Terrorism Incited by the West and its Allies. To be honest, first, when I came across your book, I was interested to see the content, and then I found one of your articles published in the internet, and it is about some of the parts of your book. You already published it. And to be honest, I am surprised that Sweden has played a role in this conflict in Syria. I already know about Germany and the Netherlands and the UK and France, and now Sweden, and you have revealed some of the what Sweden did in Syria. But I wanna ask you a few questions about this, because it's very important for our audience to know the role of these European, if it's right to say, countries in Syria, and although some of them, they don't have any geopolitical interest there. Now, you mentioned in your book, Syria's Silenced Voices, that the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, has captured ISIS terrorists. I believe this was 2 or 3 years ago, and among which were Swedish jihadists, so radical Islamists. To your knowledge, how many terrorists from Sweden joined ISIS, particularly in Syria and Iraq? And are they still held in Syria, or have they already been deported to Sweden?
Yeah, thank you. I first would like to say thank you for inviting me here. And I also think that the matter of Sweden is very important, because I meet a lot of people from different places in the world which still see Sweden as a progressive or humanitarian force in world politics. But I would like to say that Sweden is not a member of NATO. But we have a special host country agreement with NATO. I will call it a membership light. Okay. And it's something like that when you discuss Sweden in the world. Yes, we have a kind of membership light of NATO. Yeah, and now to your question. In 2019, there were a lot of ISIS terrorists from many countries who were arrested in Syria. I don't know the exact figure, but the Swedish security police, they say that around 300 Swedes went to Syria from 2012 until 2019. But I mean, you have to be careful with the words here, because in media, among politicians, they always talk about Swedes in ISIS or ISIS travelers. But if you look at the study made by the National Defense College in Sweden concerning 267 of these people who went to Syria, 80% of them ended up in ISIS. But half of them, they went to Syria early, when ISIS did not exist. Wow. So many of these Swedes, they were actually members of groups first under the umbrella of the Free Syrian Army. 30% of them, they were members of Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda in Syria.
Wow.
So I mean that these Swedish jihadist fighters, many were first in the Free Syrian Army. It means that they were members of the armed wing of the same opposition that was supported by the Swedish government. But I think that is the reason why media in Sweden, they only talk about Swedes in ISIS, because they pretend that there are no connections between these Swedes and the groups supported by Sweden. And you asked about the figure. As I said, around 300 went to Syria. Some of them got killed. A few are prisoners in the SDF area in the northeast. And in May this year, we heard that there were among 30 to 40 Swedish children. Some of them were born in these prison camps, and they were in these camps together with their mothers, but nobody knows the exact figures. No. Some of them have escaped. And important to say also is at least half of these 300 Swedish terrorists, they are back in Sweden. A lot of them, they say that they didn't know what happened in the caliphate. They say things like, I was just living there, I was driving a taxi, I was driving an ambulance, I didn't participate in the murdering or raping people, or I didn't see that happening. And unfortunately, less than a handful of the returnees are convicted of terror crimes. Most of them are living free in Sweden. And many of the mothers who returned with the children, they have lost custody of the children. This is the fact.
I think the viewers can see my eyes, like my eyes are gonna go out, and I mean it's similar case in Germany. Around more than 400 jihadists went to Syria, and a lot of women traveled to Syria, and some of them returned back, and even like with the knowledge of the German authorities, they returned and nobody touched them. Yeah. Until someone wrote or made a buzz about it, like the case of Umayma Abdi, when she was in Raqqa and she married two notorious ISIS terrorists, and she had children from them. And according to a journalist, her name is, I believe, Jumana, from an Emirati channel, she posted a documentary about her and how she was actually enslaving other women in Syria. And the police in Germany, they posted a note on Twitter saying, yes, we know about her case after this documentary. So they knew that she was in Syria and they knew that she returned back, and they did nothing to her. And to add, she was working as a translator for in a refugee camp. She returned in Hamburg and she's working as if nothing happened in Syria. And for her enslavement of Syrian women, she received 6 months of prison sentence. 6 months. That means you can go to Syria, you can enslave people, and you receive 6 months. And this is very crazy. And when you talk about these issues with your European friends or German or Swiss, they really, a lot of them aren't aware of what happened and what their governments did in Syria. But before we continue this discussion, I would like to mention to all my followers and friends who are watching this, guys, Patrik's book is on Amazon. So I will put the link in the description. You can go and purchase the book from Amazon and you can read it by yourself. It's in English. And I think it's extremely important for you to read this book and also understand how Sweden was engaged in this war in Syria. And also you have to know that these techniques that Sweden adopted is similar also to other European countries, so that you can also learn some of the lessons. Patrik, has the Swedish government in the early days of the Syrian war turned a blind eye to these radicals to join ISIS in Syria? I'm saying you this particularly because the German public television ZDF has interviewed, I believe in 2014, the head of Bayern's State Crime Bureau, who said honestly that Germany wanted the radicals to leave the country to Syria and Iraq because it will make Germany safer for its own citizens.
That sounds really terrible, what he said, and if that's true. My answer about Sweden is that I don't know. The propaganda war in media was almost as intense as the war on the ground, and the problem is that most politicians and the media in Sweden, they accepted the image that the United States and the Syrian opposition gave. They accepted this as the truth.
Yes.
And I think that some of them, at least in the beginning, probably believed also that Sweden and the Western world were supporting forces fighting for democracy, human rights, and gender equality, and everything they said. And I mean, if you have that image of the conflict, then you probably won't see anything wrong with people going to Syria fighting for freedom. But we know that was a false image. But of course, there were people in Sweden also from the beginning who realized what was happening and turned a blind eye. But I don't think it was because they wanted these people to leave. Because if that was the case, why did Sweden let them back in the country after being trained by terrorist fighters? And I also want to point that a lot of the people who went to Syria, they had not been these hardcore radical Islamists for a long time. I mean, some of them, they weren't even religious at all, not long before they left for Syria. But unfortunately, I don't have a real answer about this.
So maybe they go to Syria and they have been indoctrinated in Syria by these radical groups. Also, I have to mention this because some of the fighters who enrolled or they went to fight alongside the Free Syrian Army, they weren't hardcore jihadists at the beginning, but through time and after all this indoctrination and the money that has been spent on them, a lot of them, they also learned that the only way to gain a momentum or have a special status among these terrorist groups, you should be a hardcore jihadist or an Islamist for them also to survive and continue. Now, Swedish politicians suggesting harsh punishments for Swedish ISIS terrorists. What is the nature of the punishment and what is the guarantee that these terrorists will eventually abandon their radical ideology? And why would they be persecuted in Sweden when they have committed crimes against the Syrian people, especially that you mentioned some of them are still held in Syria? Why aren't they being persecuted in Syria?
Yeah, the short answer on this question, they were demanding a lot of harsh punishments, especially in 2019 when the last ISIS village fell. But almost nothing has happened. A few have been convicted of terrorist crimes. Some of them have been convicted of other crimes which they have committed in Sweden after they returned. But most of them are not punished at all. And in Sweden, membership in a terrorist organization is not a crime by law. And it is also a difficult question about criminalizing membership in terrorist organization, because who decides which organization is a terrorist organization? But this is a discussion now in Sweden to make a new law.
And
yeah.
They're proposing a new law now for this?
Yes, they are proposing a new law that says it will be criminal to be a member of a terrorist organization. And it could be okay if you're a member of ISIS, but a lot of people are also warning that it could be used against other organizations and people. As we know, in the European Union, some Palestinian organizations are seen as terrorist organizations, as for example. Mm-hmm. And I mean, to these questions, of course, all crimes committed in Syria, like all killing, raping, and so on, I mean, of course, it should be a crime in Syria as well as it is in Sweden. And I think also that if Syria has the capacity and want to prosecute the foreign fighters, of course, Syria should have the right to do that, like any other country is doing with foreign criminals. I mean, that is praxis in other questions. Finally, I could say that of course, we have no guarantees that these people have changed their minds about ISIS and this radical ideology. We have no such guarantees.
Here in Germany, they open indoctrination or de-radicalization schools for the returnees from Syria and Iraq, especially for ISIS fighters, and they say they are educating them to become maybe less radical. I'm not really sure how much these programs are successful, because we only learn from the media that the schools have been established, and then we don't read anything about the results of this of these schools. You know, they don't want to show us how much successful they were, and unfortunately, it is increasingly becoming a taboo to speak about these issues. And when you speak frequently about it, you will be smeared, you will be called different names, and especially by the mainstream media, they want to discredit you. And you mentioned this, and you said the the punishments, the tough punishments that are suggested are hypocritical. But the question is, why Sweden and other countries were silent all these years? This phenomenon was well known for years. Why now?
I mean, in a conflict or a war zone, it could be difficult to know what is happening, at least in the beginning. But in Syria, after a while, there were information available, at least for people with a critical mind and for people who had not forgotten the lies before the Iraq war, because that was not that long ago. But why they have been silent despite their knowledge, unfortunately, I think you have to ask them. But I could tell you that I have personally tried to inform MPs in Sweden and media in Sweden on important issues concerning Sweden's involvement in Syria. And I could give you some facts about Sweden in Syria and give an example when they choose not to say anything about Sweden's terror links, even though they knew. And I have to point out that Sweden has not sent weapons or directly aided the armed groups like Britain or Netherlands have. Sweden had a different role. Together with Germany, we have been more supporting the political wing, the Syrian National Council, and later the Syrian opposition coalition. And Sweden was very early on this. Already in 2012, the then foreign minister, Carl Bildt in Sweden, he invited the Syrian opposition leadership to a meeting at the castle outside Stockholm, the capital of Sweden. And everything on this meeting was paid by Sweden. And they were accepted there, despite they openly talked about that they need to get more weapons in the fight against the Syrian government. And after that, in 2013, Sweden took part in forming a project for humanitarian aid connected to the opposition. And I have got a lot of Swedish official internal documents about this project, and it's really interesting to read it. Because according to Swedish participants at a meeting in Paris in 2013, the French foreign minister, Laurent Fabius, he said bluntly that the Western-backed Syrian opposition, they have too little support in the so-called liberated areas. And the solution to this popularity problem, it was to set up an aid agency under the formal leadership of the Syrian opposition coalition. And you could read this in the internal report from the Swedish Foreign Ministry. And it says that the people of Syria would begin in this way to associate the humanitarian aid with the opposition and thereby begin to support them. So what they were doing was that they decided to buy popular support for Syrian leaders that the West had selected and approved. And this project got the name Syrian Recovery Trust Fund. And Germany also has a central position in this. And the Syrian representative who put his name on the founding document, which I have, his name was Ahmad Jarba, which I think you know very well of. At that time, the president of the Syrian opposition coalition. And only, I think it was 6 or 7 months after this trust fund got 4 million euros from Sweden, Ahmad Jarba entered the small city of Kesab in the northwest of Syria, together with Jabhat al-Nusra and other extremists. And they made the population of 2,000 Armenian Christian people to flee for their lives. And he said in public statement that his forces liberated Kasab. I would call it ethnic cleansing. A year after this, in April 2015, the successor of Ahmed Yarba as opposition president, Khaled Koya, he openly stated at the news conference at the UN headquarters that the Syrian opposition coalition had a tactical alliance with Al-Qaeda in Idlib.
Yes.
Yeah, and what I want to come to with this is that in 2015, I wrote a full-page article in the opinion section in one of the largest daily papers in Sweden. I wrote about the Syrian opposition coalition, their participation in the ethnic cleansing in Kasab, their collaboration with Al-Qaeda, and I could show it with facts. And I demanded that Sweden should stop its payments to the opposition and this recovery trust fund. And I also sent the article and questions to all political parties in the international committee in the parliament. And I made contact with several ministers about this question. None of them bothered to answer. No one answered the opinion article in one of the largest papers in Sweden. No one even answered my email, despite several reminders and even phone calls. I met finally one MP of the Green Party, and he was honestly upset about this Swedish connection, but all the others were silent. And finally, after 6 months, the secretary of the Minister of Development Aid in the government, she answered my questions, but she denied that the opposition had any connections to terrorist groups. She even claimed that the opposition had nothing to do with what happened in Kasab. And this is my point. No one could say in this case that they didn't know, but they choose to be silent.
Wow. I have to mention a few things here. First, Ahmed Jarba, before the war, he was a smuggler in Syria and everybody knows him. So he used to work in an illegal, his business was illegal business, let's say. And the invasion of Kasab, since some of the Swedish politicians are denying the link between Al-Qaeda and the Syrian opposition, let us remind them that one of the officers or the commanders of the Free Syrian Army, his name is Abu Sakkar, the guy who slaughtered a Syrian army officer and he ate his organs and he documented it on video while he is slaughtering the soldier and taking out his heart and eating it. He was part, and his group were part of the invasion of Kasab alongside al-Nusra and the multinational jihadists who were from Chechnya, from Uzbekistan, from Saudi Arabia. Muhaisini was there. And there were many, I think also Egyptian jihadists were there. And I remember the night when the invasion happened and how the National Defense Forces from Latakia, they drove like very fast to Kasab for them to evacuate the Armenians from Kasab. So basically it was an attempt for ethnic cleansing for the Armenians, which they all fled to Latakia, and they couldn't return back unless after a year or so when the NDF, the National Defense Forces, liberated Kasab. And I have written an article about this issue in Akhbar newspaper. And I want to mention this because it's funny. I have published, first of all, I've been contacted by Al Jazeera English, and an Armenian producer from Al Jazeera English told me, we want you to write an article about this issue. And I was quite surprised, and I was like, do you guys know my political opinion? And she was like, yeah, of course, we know you very well, and we know your opinion about the war. And but we have, you have, our platform is very, let's say, tolerant towards other opinions, and you can write your opinion. It's an opinion article. It represents your opinion. I said, okay.
Yeah.
How much time do I have? She said 24 hours. So in 24 hours, I was documenting everything and writing, and I have written like 1,400 words, short investigation, let's say. And I submitted my article, and no answer coming from Al Jazeera. So I started to send emails again. And after 3 days, she called me on the phone and told me, she feels very embarrassed because the editor's team, they refused to publish the article because it shows direct link of Turkey to these jihadists. And she said, if you let me paraphrase your article, it could be published. They want to change al-Nusra to opposition. They want to change the ethnic cleansing to liberation and all this stuff. So I refused to publish the article in Al Jazeera. And then I published it in Al Akhbar. And that article got tens of thousands of shares on Facebook, because back then it was Armenians, they can raise their voice, especially those who are in the diaspora, and especially those in the United States. And let's remember, they have a strong lobby there. And funny enough, Kim Kardashian, she joined this campaign, and she has millions of followers. So everyone was interested all of a sudden about Kesa. But it's also a sad story, because were it not for the Armenians, so the West doesn't care about, or all these activists or influencers, they don't care about the other Syrians, right? Because we are Syrians of Armenian origins. Okay, they treated us especially in the media, let's say, but the others who were ethnically cleansed in other towns, from other religions and sects, nobody blinked an eye for them. It's really crazy what happened in the past years. Now, I want to ask you something, because this is very important for me. Personally, I was investigating this case since 2011. Now, in your book, you mentioned in November 2012, the Swedish Syrian Yasser Sayed Isa was interviewed on Swedish TV4's news program concerning the Mujahideen fi Asham. And the Sayed said, I quote, "This is a very natural consequence of the passivity of the outside world concerning taking action and helping those who are suffering in Syria." Now, has the Swedish TV4 mentioned to its audience that Yasser Sayed is in fact the son of Tarif Sayed Isa, who is a notorious radical from the Muslim Brotherhood, who fought against the Syrian government in the 80s and was a member of the Fighting Vanguard, which back then committed horrendous terrorist attacks. And recently, he went to Idlib and fought alongside al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and he died there.
I think that this interview is really terrible. It's an example of lousy journalism. During the war in Syria, TV and papers, they often made interviews with people connected to the Muslim Brotherhood or other opposition or armed groups, or they used these people as some kind of neutral eyewitnesses. And of course, they never said that their words could be biased or that they had connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. I remember that the British journalist Patrik Paulov,
yes,
he wrote early in the war something like this. I will read this quote. "I can't think of any other war or crisis I have covered in which propagandistic, biased, or secondhand sources have been so readily accepted by journalists as providers of objective facts." And I totally agree with him. We've seen the same thing during the years after 2012. And I think one of the worst situations was during the liberation of Eastern Aleppo in 2016. I think you remember those last messages from people in Eastern Aleppo that they said goodbye. This is the last we say before we die, before we become massacred by the Syrian army.
And none of them died. None of them died.
No, none of them did. And one of them was Bilal Abdul Karim,
Yes.
the comedian from New York, who converted to Islam and became a supporter of these
I'm happy that you mentioned him as a comedian, because he is a comedian, not a journalist.
Yeah, he is. But all Swedish media, they published these messages, and they also called Bilal Abdul Karim an ordinary citizen in Aleppo. But no, he's an American who was in Syria illegally supporting armed groups. But of course, they didn't say that. And I think we lack critical journalism. In every war, there is propaganda and interests behind all information and so-called facts from all the sides. So you have to be critical. And as a journalist, you cannot pretend that someone is neutral when he is taking a clear stand in an armed conflict and even has personal connections to them. It's lousy journalism to do that.
Actually, I want to mention also that the Swedish TV4 also, of course, they didn't mention that the brother of Yasser Sayed is Fida Sayed. And Fida Sayed is the founder of the Facebook page, of the official Facebook page of the so-called Syrian revolution, where most, if not all, anti-government protests were organized, and they were even choosing the names of the, because every Friday they were protesting mostly on every Friday, and they used to give names for this protest. And he was the Fida Sayed who was managing this from Sweden, managing what's going to happen in Syria. Unfortunately, all these facts were absent from the media, and as you mentioned, they are treating them as if they are some sort of neutral people. And many of them live here in Germany, and they are receiving, let's say, a very special treatment by the German government, comparing to people like me who are who do not, like, personally, I don't have, let's say, cultural or religious or any ideological conflict with the German values, the German traditions, the way of life. I'm well integrated. I speak German. I have 2 jobs and I pay my taxes. And despite that, I'm under attack. And the radical Muslim Brotherhood guys who are cruising freely in the streets, they are not receiving any criticism, unfortunately. And I hope that Germany follows the what happened in Vienna, Austria. They banned the Muslim Brotherhood, and I have made 6 episodes about the Muslim Brotherhood from its formation in the early 1920s, the British collusion with with the Muslim Brotherhood, their attempt against the Jamal Abdel Nasser, and then against Hafez al-Assad, the Arab Spring, and finally how the Muslim Brotherhood, according to their own literature, to their own books, to their own statements, are preparing for a culture, not preparing, they're already prepared that, but they are adopting their strategy in cultural invasion of the West, for them to destroy the West from within, from inside the West. But and because of that 6 episodes that I made, Al Jazeera posted a documentary. It is 30 minutes documentary, I believe, and 5 minutes of it is about me.
Okay, I haven't seen it.
And the title of the documentary is Assad's Assassins in Europe. So I am part of that documentary. They are trying to portray me as some sort of an assassin because of that that 6 episodes that I posted on. So all of a sudden, I became an assassin. I became a spy. And Assad is sending me letters in Germany through third parties, and I'm receiving his written messages, things that you like you watch it and you think like, are they talking about me? Or, and it's like, all this goes without you can't even sue them. They don't have a representative office in Germany because it should have a legal status. So they're in Doha. Where are you gonna sue them? In Doha,
Yeah.
they're owned by Doha, right? So they can say whatever they want, and because they're too powerful and too strong, people would fall for this. And
yeah, they have great influence.
Yes, and unfortunately, because of that documentary, usually when I walk in the streets, and those who are sympathizers with the let's say Free Syrian Army, Al-Nusra, and even ISIS, and there are people who show sympathy to these terrorist organizations. When they see me in the street, the least they do is like attacking me verbally or physically, and so Al Jazeera doesn't tell their people go and attack this guy. Mood against you, and they will always be lone wolves, as we say, to act, and it's a very unfortunate. My last question, Patrik, it was really interesting, this chat. I don't want to end it, but this is my last question. To your knowledge, what is next on the table of the Swedish government, and how are they going to clean the mess they have exported to Syria, or if there were any plans for that?
Yeah, I could tell you when I wrote the last chapters of the book, of the Swedish edition in the spring of 2019, I tried once again to get an interview with some representative of the Swedish foreign ministry, but they refused to talk to me. They said that they did not have the possibility to do an oral interview. But they could answer some of my questions in writing. But the problem is that they never did answer my questions. They wrote a lot of words without answering the most important questions about Sweden's indirect support to Jabhat al-Nusra and other extremist groups. And I published these email exchanges in full in my book, because they reveal so clearly how the Swedish government acts. There is no will to clean up the mess because they don't admit to being guilty of any mess in Syria. And also, I finally would say that tragically, Sweden is also complicit in the European Union sanctions against Syria, which I think is a very important question. But here, in fact, Sweden or any other EU country could make a difference, because it's enough for one single country, one single foreign minister in the European Union to say no, and then the sanctions against Syria would not be renewed. And I hope that someone will be brave and for once do something good for the Syrian people. But unfortunately, I don't think it will be Sweden.
Who is the foreign minister now in Sweden, and from which party he is?
She is called Anne Linde, and from the Social Democrats.
Unfortunately, the Social Democrats and the Greens also in Germany are very much complicit in this war, and they are embedded with this regime change war. It's very unfortunate to see left-wing parties are engaging in such an operation alongside right-wing fascist groups in Syria, right? And these groups in Syria who fight the Syrian government, and I'm talking exclusively about the armed groups now, are most, if not all, are right-wing Islamist fascist groups. And if you say no to this regime change war, you become a fascist. It's an upside down word, right? They accuse you of being a fascist just because you say no for such a war on Syria. But Patrik, I'm very happy to host you. I want to do also a follow-up video with you when there are new developments on this case. And I would kindly ask my friends again to read your book, to enlighten themselves, especially those who are interested to know about the silenced voices from Syria. I will post a link in the description below, guys. You can go and check it on Amazon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.